So, hello, yeah. So there was a concept of the two messiahs that was existent in Judaism before and during the time of Jesus, and the ministry of Jesus, and they would call that Messiah ben Yosef, because Messiah ben Yosef was the ultimate picture of a suffering servant, because he went from very humble beginnings, living in Bedouin nomadic family, a shepherding family, probably shepherded goats and sheep, to the second in command of the superpower of the world at that time, Egypt. Just right below Pharaoh, he was the commander in chief, if you will. And so he went from, we talked about Yosef ben Israel, or Yosef ben Avraham, to Zaphnath Paneah. So going from the Hebrew nomad that he was, living somewhere in the land of Canaan, to someone looking very Gentile, someone looking very pagan, if you will, someone who looked like someone who did not keep faith in the God of Israel, and how that changed his appearance to the point that his own brothers would come to him eventually looking for help, because he saved the civilized world. He was the salvation for the civilized world through famine, and prevented them from undergoing the famine. And so he went from Yosef ben Israel, or Avraham, to Zaphnath Paneah, and then back to Yosef ben Avraham, that being his Hebrew name, which was interesting because he goes from the bread, Zaphnath Paneah. If you remember, he stored up grain for 7 years, and that's how he saved Egypt from the famine. So they would call him the bread of life, or he who preserves life or gives life, or a lot of translators don't know really how to treat it, but that's the best thing come with, the bread of life, basically. And then he went from that to he who increases the fold. Yosef means to supplant, increase the fold, basically, add to. And I threw a verse up there, John 10:16, and I have other sheep that are not of this fold, I must add them also, and they will listen to my voice. So we talked about that, how Joseph concealed his identity. He became salvation for the Gentile world, and saved them. And it was when his brothers sought his help that he then revealed himself. And we're yeah, that's it's really neat that they came to Egypt and everything. But when he revealed himself as a Hebrew, as their brother Yosef, let me go back. When they did that, it not only sent shockwaves through their family, but also through the Egyptian world. Suddenly, the number 2 in command revealed himself as being a Hebrew. It's someone from very, very humble beginnings became president of the United States, and they kept it secret all the time that they grew up, in the projects or something, and just had very humble beginnings. And if that was revealed, it'd be whoa, this guy, So it's not only did it reverberate within his family, but also within the Egyptian world, that he, changed his name, changed his identity, for all intents and purposes, looked like someone who was a Gentile. We talked about Torah portion Miketz, and how Genesis 41, the story, it says at the end of 2 years' time, Miketz, Pharaoh awoke, and it uses that same word Miketz. So Miketz can mean in the end and awakening, or awaking. And we talked about if we're in the end times, there would be this awakening and revealing of who our Messiah ben Yosef is. Skip ahead here. And then Messiah ben David will come as a conquering king. We believe Yeshua will return. Jesus will return as that conquering king. But showed pictures here, so we basically, as the Western Gentile world, accepted Jesus as our salvation. He saved us literally from our sins. He saved the world, and it was so fascinating about the life of Jesus. No man has reverberated and sent such shockwaves around the world like this. We believe he's God that took on flesh, but he was a man that walked the earth. He took on the form of a man who walked the earth, and he has literally reached and elevated the world to he saved the world, in a sense, elevated. And I think last week we talked about Judeo-Christian values, and how Western society is based on Judeo-Christian values, which are starting to erode now, but it's because of Jesus that our salvation, and Yeshua literally means salvation, which is really interesting. But I showed different pictures here, kind of the Jesus that we created through a couple different millennia, what he may have looked like versus what we create him to be, and then We have different Jesus there, different categories. Let's skip ahead here. So we talked about the goal of the Bible study group. It's just understanding who he was in the context of where he was teaching, what his listeners would have heard when he said certain words like disciples or go out and make disciples. That's important if we want to be good at making disciples, obviously. But let me jump over to the one I made for this week. I was doing a lot of research this week, and you guys feel free. I made this presentation for me, like, because I get sidetracked, and I'm a very like visual learner. So don't take it to mean that you can't like at any point like interject. I want your feedback too.
From Jerusalem around.
Yeah. So this week, so we talked about why study it and why study things from a Jewish perspective, and now we're going to talk about like how do we get away from this very Jewish flavored faith to what it is today. I have a review built in there. So the revelation of who he is brings shock to the civilized world, and then why study the Gospels through a Jewish lens. We kind of talked about that. Like, it's important. The Jewish hermeneutic is very different than the Western hermeneutic. How we interpret Scripture is very different. We talked about. I think we covered that. So the first thing I want to do tonight, let's get a cup of water. Is talk about like who is who in the. And I was researching this. This can come from like a Jewish literature called the Mishnah. I don't know if you guys ever heard the Mishnah. It was like a piece of rabbinic literature. Like basically, if the rabbis like had Twitter accounts during the time of Yeshua, they would send out like tweets or whatever, and so all those things would be going on like in the Twitter sphere. And it wasn't until much later that all those tweets were written down in like a book form called the Mishnah. And Mishnah just means repetitions. Or repetition. So what these Jews were saying, what these great rabbis were saying in the first century, we can kind of derive from that who was who in the first century and what that entails. So we're going to put a lot of people in a box here, which you shouldn't do, but we're going to do it tonight.
For the sake of instruction.
For the sake of instruction, we're going to box people up. There's different categories of people in the first century, and it's really important because when you read the New Testament, they use these words, and you have to understand who they were because those words are important. But there was Jews by birth, obviously. If you were born to a Jewish mother, you were a Jew. And then there's Jews by legal conversion. So like if you liked the Jewish faith and you worshiped the God of Israel, you could go through legal conversion, which would entail like circumcision, and then like mikvah, you go into like the waters, like baptized basically, and come up as a Jew. Like in every sense of the word, you would be considered a naturally born Jew. Then we had Gentiles, and Gentiles in the first century world, they were idolaters. That was like a synonymous term for like idolater or pagan. And then you had Gentile God-fearers. And those were people who did not go through legal conversion to become a Jew, but they feared the God of Israel. And Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 would have been an example of that. Cornelius was someone who feared and worshipped the God of Israel, even though he was a Roman officer. He was a God-fearer. So you have Gentiles who are basically, when you say Gentile, in Hebrew it'd be goy or goyim, that implies that they're like an idolater and they do idolatrous practices. But a Gentile God-fearer would imply that they are someone who left all that, and maybe they take on some like Jewish things, like maybe Sabbath observance, maybe eat kosher, things like that. But they haven't gone through legal conversion to become a Jew. And then there's Gentiles by assimilation. So that's a Jew that has become a Gentile through the reversal of circumcision, which was done, I don't know how, but the reversal of circumcision or just different things you would assimilate culturally from going from a Jew down to like a Gentile and actually practice, idolatry basically. So going from monotheism to polytheism and start worshiping the gods of Rome or something. Romans 2:29, Paul describes a Jew as someone who is a Jew inwardly, and it's not about flesh, it's not about circumcision of the heart. So you can kind of flux back and forth between, you can be a Jew by birth, sort of, but if you're not living a Jewish life, Paul says that you technically aren't a Jew if you aren't one inwardly. The circumcision really amounts to nothing if you aren't living it, basically. So I wanted to kind of categorize those people groups because it's important when we go into this tonight. There's going to be some key words that as we get later into Rome. But first thing, there's like 400 years of silence when we read our Bibles. Like when you go from, depending on what canon of scripture you're reading, it's like the book of Malachi to Matthew. I think the Christian Bible's no, that's the Christian canonized version. It's Malachi to Matthew. But you're taught in like elementary or Sunday school that there's 400 years of silence, and God didn't really have any word for prophets or anything like that during this 400 years of silence. But a lot happened during this 400 years of silence. You have like the Maccabees, and the whole story of Hanukkah happened in those 400 years. And then Pompey comes. Those were the Seleucid Greeks. But then Pompey, who's with the Romans, comes in and he conquers Judea in 63 BC. So 63 years before the time of Christ. Pompey, who's a great general, comes in. He happened to be in the area, and there was a civil war going on in Judea at that time. I believe they're brothers, they're princes. They're fighting over the throne, basically. There it is right there. And so one of them reaches out to Pompey, and he's like, hey, help us out. Like, put down this revolt, basically, the civil war, and we'll kind of be in bed with you. And we're kind of like, and so then the Romans moved in. They stopped the civil war. They appointed him as the king, or like kind of like the puppet king. But then the Romans just kind of stuck around after that. And they were like, we're going to stick around for the long run here. And so they became sort of like this client kingdom, part of the Roman Empire at that point. So Pompey moved in 63 BC, and that's why when you open the book of Matthew and suddenly you start seeing the Romans, you're like, wait, where do they come from? And I was perplexed by that. Like, why are the Romans suddenly on the scene when you read the New Testament? And that's why. It's because here's Pompey. Here's a picture of Pompey coming in. He laid siege to Jerusalem and defeated it, and then took slaves back to the Roman provinces from whence he came. He took many, many slaves, Jewish slaves, back to the Roman provinces. So that's important because when he takes all these slaves back to Rome, they take them to all these Roman provinces, which can be anywhere from Turkey, modern-day Turkey, all the way to Italy. And so you have these Jewish families who are like scattered all over these Mediterranean, all over the Roman Empire, really, thousands and thousands of Jewish slaves. When a Roman slave was freed, they were given full Roman citizenship, and they called it libertas. It included the right to vote, which is really different than a lot of cultures in that time, which is interesting. We can kind of postulate about Paul. Paul was a Jew who was a Roman citizen, and there's not much mentioned about his parents from Tarsus, but when you look at, I put Romans 7, it should be Acts 7. Sorry about that. It should be Acts 7. When we look at when Paul first comes on the scene, Saul of Tarsus, he's called. It's right after Stephen is going into the synagogue of the freedmen, and that would imply like they were once captive men. So they're a synagogue that is comprised of probably freed Roman slaves who went back to Jerusalem and started a synagogue, probably Greek-speaking Jews. And then Stephen goes in, who was a Greek-speaking Jew. There was like a lot of division going on in the early disciples. They were trying to figure out like the Greek Jews are being neglected, the Greek widows and everything. And so that's when like Stephen comes in. That's when Stephen is stoned, and that's when we see Paul emerge. Is like the time of like the synagogue of the freedmen. So it's interesting to postulate maybe Paul was a child or a grandchild of emancipated Roman slaves, which is interesting to think about, because 100 years before this story happens in Acts chapter 7 is when they all went into slavery in Rome and all these different Roman provinces. So it could be like his grandparents were Roman slaves, and that's how he kind of inherited his Roman citizenship. I don't know, but it's cool to think about, right? So, so the result of thousands of Jewish families being relocated to Roman provinces everywhere from modern-day Turkey to Rome. And then some of these slaves began to return by the first century. I mean, Paul, if he was descendants of freed slaves, he came back. Stephen, if he was a member of the synagogue of freedmen. So they began to come back. But how do we know this? If we look at Acts chapter 2, maybe Javon, if you want to turn to Acts 2 real fast. And there's a part, verse 5 through 12, if you want to go there.
You want me to read it?
Sure.
Okay. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. And they were amazed and astonished, saying, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us in his own native language? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabians. We hear them telling in our own tongues the mighty works of God," and all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others mocking said, "They are filled with new wine."
Yeah, so it's really interesting timing that all these people are there for a pilgrimage feast called Shavuot, or Pentecost. They're there because that's one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts, and they're coming from all these different parts of the world. Many of those places you read were Roman provinces, so many of those people were probably emancipated slaves who began making the pilgrimage back to Jerusalem to worship at these 3 pilgrimage feasts. And so we hear them speaking in those own unique languages. And what that does is that when they go back and they leave Jerusalem, because they would have probably come to Jerusalem at Passover and then stayed the 50 days to Shavuot, because they wouldn't go all the way back and then come back 50 days later. They probably stayed. And so when they heard all the good news, the gospel being shared to them in their own languages, that basically it disseminated all that information back to all those Roman provinces. And so what we see are like basically believers taking the gospel back to their home countries, their home cities and Roman provinces around the Mediterranean Ocean, and they take those back to their synagogues and their communities, and they start to share what they experienced at Shavuot this year in Jerusalem. It's like this crazy stuff. People start speaking in our own language. These Galileans start speaking in our own languages, and probably would have been really big news. Something big was happening. So that's kind of, I think that's how the gospel got back to especially Rome. That's how the gospel got there, because what we see is Paul never goes to Rome until his imprisonment. He wants to go to Rome, as we see in his letters, but he never makes it until he's actually imprisoned and taken to Rome to try before Caesar. But the gospel somehow gets there before he does, which is interesting. And I think it's because some of these visitors who were there in Acts 2 took it back with them. There's so much more about Shavuot and Pentecost that we're not going to get into tonight, but we'll save it for a different night. So basically, the Roman occupation of Judea, the best thing I can come up with to try to make it, from what I was reading, what I was researching, is like when American troops went into Afghanistan, we were so there's men sitting in Tampa Bay with remote controls, flying drones over the heads of these Afghanis who, for them, probably didn't have TVs, probably didn't have electricity or indoor plumbing, and here come these armored personnel vehicles and helicopters and stealth bombers and these guys looking like this right here. And I mean, we probably had a lot less of a heavy hand than the Romans did, but you have this very ancient culture that's far or near Middle Eastern culture based on honor and respect, and based on familial values and intense pious religion, albeit a different religion. And then we have this, for the most part, secular dominating force coming in and occupying their land and trying to interact, and there's this tension there. And so you imagine being this young Galilean boy, one of these guys here, and seeing a legion of Roman cavalry go through your town on horseback. It would be whoa, it would be just so awe-inspiring and breathtaking. You imagine these boys seeing armored personnel carriers or tanks driving down the road, and these guys walking around with all this weaponry and stuff. It would just be really baffling to them. But the Romans, they did something a little bit probably heavier handed than American troops, where they liked to tax the people where they went. They would always take tribute from people. We see Jesus even addressing them. He says, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but God what is God's." But they would go and they would tax. And what they would do is they would use that money that they taxed, and they would use it to further their military campaigns, or build pagan temples in places that they conquered. They would build temples to the pantheon of gods like Jupiter, Mithra, whatever. That's interesting because in Luke 23, the one thing that the Sanhedrin takes Yeshua to Pilate, and they say, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Messiah, a king." So the one thing they try to like really peg down on him is the fact that he, it's a false accusation, obviously, but that he said, "Don't give Caesar his taxes," and that's the one thing they try to peg him with, and it wasn't true because he said, "Give unto Caesar." But so yeah, the Romans would tax people. They would go around. They would set up booths. And basically, they would hire people, like Matthew, for instance, to collect taxes. And they basically said, you can collect as much as you want. Here's the minimum that you need to give us, but you can keep anything. Zacchaeus is another one. You can keep anything over and above, but you need to give us this minimum, basically. And so they would go around, and they were seen as very, very hated people. They were in bed with the Romans. They were traitors. And so for Jesus to dine with those people, and to like call some of those people to be his disciples was a very taboo thing to do. So then the trial, I'm fast forwarding very quickly here, but the trial and execution of Yeshua happens at the prompting mainly of the Sadducean and priestly class, and it was carried out by the Romans. The Sanhedrin at that time could not issue a death penalty. They were kind of like they had one hand tied behind their back, which is why they didn't just like stone him or something like that. At some points they did try to stone him, but they legally weren't allowed to carry out the death penalty. What's interesting, when we see Yeshua being brought before Pilate at Passover, it was customary for Pilate to release one prisoner at Passover, and he says, "I'll give you Barabbas. Is that how you say it? Barabbas? Okay. I'll give you Barabbas or Yeshua or Jesus of Nazareth." But what's interesting about this is his name, Barabbas' name, was Yeshua Bar Abba, and probably, I don't know the percentage, a lot of the early manuscripts of Matthew actually say Jesus Bar Abba or Yeshua Bar Abba, and they say that maybe the copyists left it out to show respect to Jesus, and they didn't want to like have his name be the same as this insurrectionist, this insurgent guy. But his name was Jesus, son, and that would translate as Yeshua, son of the Father. So he was like, do you want Yeshua, the son of the Father, or do you want Yeshua, son of the Father? Not knowing that he was really the son of the Father, which is a really interesting thing. Which one do you want me to release to you? Yeshua, son of the Father, or Yeshua, son of the Father, whom his followers call Messiah? And so what we see with Barabbas is he wasn't just a thief, he wasn't just like some thug, he was someone who was trying to incite a rebellion against the Romans. And he was what they looked for, what they were hoping for in Messiah, what Messiah would fulfill. And so when we have a Prince of Peace coming, and they wanted a Prince of Peace, or they didn't want the Prince of Peace, they wanted someone to overthrow the occupational forces of that time. Mm-hmm. But Yeshua was like, no, we gotta settle debts first, and then I can come as king. And so they're like, no, give us the insurgent. And then what's really interesting is when you see basically like the writing in the New Testament is basically over at this point, but in the 60s and 70s we see these little revolts start popping up over taxation, and ultimately it ends with Titus coming in. We'll talk about this in a minute. Titus comes in and he levels the temple, he levels Jerusalem. He's like, basically, I'm sick of all these Jews revolting and causing all these problems, and he just wipes the whole slate clean. And but it's interesting that if Yeshua Bar Abba, Barabbas, this rabble-rouser, insurgent guy, is released, I mean, if I was an insurgent who hated Romans, and you can liken it to like the prisoners at Gitmo, for instance, like these captured insurgents who were taken and held captive for a dozen years by this idolatrous, they view them as dirty, idolatrous Westerners, and probably not treated the greatest there, but if you were suddenly released and just suddenly given your liberty, the first thing you would do is go find your buddies and be like, we got to kill as many of those people as possible, you know what I'm saying? And so Barabbas probably did likewise. He probably went back and was like, hey, it's time to revolt, like it's go time, And so right after we see Barabbas released, we see these little revolts popping up, and then ultimately temple being leveled. So it's almost like when they said we want the insurgent, they're saying like we want the guy who's going to cause more problems and ultimately get our temple destroyed. It's like you kind of get what you want, you get what you wish for there. But I don't know. I'm just speculating, but it's likely. Yeah. You guys have any thoughts so far?
That whole previous thing of the Yeshua Bar Abba.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I've never heard.
Barabbas'
That.
name was Yeshua?
Yeshua Bar Abba, yeah, was his name. Barabbas is a Greek, it's a Greek transliteration of Bar Abba, which
So-
Bar Abba is Bar Abba is actually Aramaic. Bar, like, Bar means son of or son, and Abba means the father, like Abba Father. So he's Yeshua, son of the Father. So I don't know if his father's name was Abba or what.
That's so interesting, though.
Yeah.
I mean, and the whole thing, like, it's only ever been explained to me as like, this thug, this thief, this,
No.
whatever, this criminal, but never this like rebellious insurgent. Like that's
Yeah.
so.
Yeah,
And I mean, the same name thing like that just kind of blows my
yeah, it is really creepy. I think that was the point. I think that was like that was the point where it was like, never mind, I won't go into it. But basically, I think that was a pivot point for the people of Israel at that point. Like they had a decision to make, and it came down to that one decision. And they were like, do you want the insurgent king? Do you want a king, or do you want someone to rectify your sins and reconcile you back to me? And when they chose the king, because it says in the Torah, like, don't choose a king for yourself. And the Torah says that, don't choose a king for yourself. I want to be your king, but I know, and I'm going to put judges over you, but I know that eventually you're going to ask for a king. And when you do, he has to be a king who loves the Torah and has to write his own copy of the Torah. And so it's just kind of like in our nature, we just love a king, And you look at like the elections right now, and it's like how many people would just want a king,
Right.
And it's like we
Or
just
a
still,
dictator.
yeah, or a dictator. But we don't know that he's a dictator yet. We just
Oh, I was
we think
talking
he's just
about
a
either one.
benevolent.
I was
Oh
talking
yeah.
about either one.
We just think he's he or she is a benevolent king or queen, and so they're not going to turn into a dictator. It's impossible.
Right.
But yeah, we're just so blinded by it, and it's like I don't know why we have that in us, but
Galatians, Galatia,
yeah.
different places.
And so
Yeah.
the no go.
No, I totally lost my thought.
Okay. Well, you think of it. Stop me.
I'll tell you.
Just interrupt me if you think of it. So the gospel spreads to all these outlying areas because of Acts 2, first and foremost, but then also because Paul starts taking all these trips. I think this is his third journey right here. So he does a lot of traveling and a lot of teaching of the gospel at all these little communities that were already existing. Like he didn't just pick some arbitrary place on the map and say, I want to go here. Like these were already existing communities because these were places where the slaves were taken to. So he knew that. And so he was going there to these already established synagogues and communities who had been there for 100 years already, and he was teaching them the gospel and saying, "Hey, your Messiah came. He died for you. Like he came as Yeshua ben Yosef, Messiah ben Yosef, the suffering servant. Our sins have been forgiven." And sometimes his message was welcomed, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes he was nearly stoned to death, but sometimes, like the Bereans, for instance, really studied out and accepted his message. So Paul does all this, and he helps further the gospel into Asia Minor and into Rome. Well, not really into Rome yet, because he didn't make it to Rome at this point, but really like these parts of Roman provinces. And he dies in 67. It's believed that he died. We don't have that in the scriptures, but most scholars agree that he died in the late 60s. The 60s were hard on a lot of people.
I can't. Gabe, you're so hilarious.
Yeah.
What's that?
The 60s. The 60s were. Oh yeah. So we're in the 60s now. Okay. So Yeshua died. So we're 60 years after that, basically. But fast forward to the 60s, and we meet the Flava Flaves, and they're called the Flavian dynasty, the Flavian emperors, basically. So these are the emperors that controlled Rome through. They were like basically 69 to 96. So for a long time, these three guys were. I don't think they're like father, son, son, or father, father. I think they're more like it's like uncle nephew kind of relationship. I need to check that out, but I think they're more like uncle nephew kind of stuff. So these are the Roman emperors that took power soon after Yeshua was crucified and resurrected and ascended, the Flavian dynasty. So I'll keep going here. This guy, Vespasian, seized power, and then Titus was the one who conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD and leveled Jerusalem. And it was really interesting. I was reading. Jerusalem had these like crazy big walls, and this is recorded in Josephus's writings, the Jewish Wars. He was a very meticulous historian. Rome would come upon Jerusalem, and they would usually lay siege to a city. And if it had walls, like Jerusalem had really big walls, they would build a second wall next to it, and then fill that trough in basically with stuff like rubble and dirt and stone, and they would create this like embankment, and then they could create fortresses on top of that embankment, and just basically just like they would have like a bird's eye view of the entire city that they were laying siege to, and just bombard it. You know, so they were like they would trap people in there for months and months and months, not let anyone out, and starve them to death. And then the last survivors, they would just start picking them off. So Titus did that. I mean, Titus, just nasty dude.
That sounds like the Assyrians.
Yeah.
Francine Rivers, who's
Yeah.
an author. She wrote a book. She wrote a series
I feel like we have her books.
called The Mark of the Lion or something like that. It's 3 books.
Do you think my
Yeah.
are okay if they stay on?
I think it'll be okay.
Anyway, it's just the first book starts in the midst of that, and it was the best.
I feel like Stacy's read those books. Yeah.
It is the most
Gory.
like specific description most vivid description I've heard of that process. It feels a lot more like, yeah, I don't know, it felt a lot more like war than like a one-line thing.
Yeah.
Just because, you know, it gave you a broad scale of what was actually happening. Kind of like what you were saying, of like, it gave you the inside and outside view.
Yeah.
But particularly getting the inside view of not thinking like, oh, they just came in and, because I'm thinking like a campaign, a military campaign.
Right.
I'm thinking in terms of like weeks,
Mm-hmm.
maybe a couple months, 3 months, 4 months. But they were like, you know, it's month 8 or month 10 or something. And
Yeah.
it's like, so they're living like that, and you had like kids who were just older than our ages, and they had like a few younger kids, and you're thinking like 10 months in the life of someone
You
who's
lived in
under 10. You're like,
Yeah.
it's just that becomes your whole reality, day-to-day reality. Like even just trying to get your hands on basic food. I mean, it's like living in a
Yeah.
whole different place.
I think it's Josephus writes that mothers were eating their own infants, like through starvation, which is foretold in the prophets that would happen to Jerusalem, that they would eat the flesh of their children, which is just crazy. But they say that anyone that tried to escape the city while it was under siege, under Roman siege, they would crucify right there, then and there. And they estimate there would be around 500 crucifixions a day of people trying to escape the city. They estimate 1.1 million men, women, and children were killed within that time span, and 97,000 Jews were carried into slavery and all
So
this.
that's interesting. I was wondering how accurate that was, but they had the thing and they went through the whole thing
In the book? that you're
in the
talking
book,
about?
and they actually went to the end of that, and then I didn't know it was that many because we were getting a more personalized view. But they were like they marched on foot all the way. Well, I guess marching would be on foot, but they were shackled on foot all the way to Rome
That's intense.
Did
after that whole.
they
thing.
surrender to the Romans?
No.
Or did it?
No.
Or the Romans decided when to stop?
No, they just starved them out, and eventually,
They survived.
Josephus writes that there were zealots who lived within Jerusalem, and the zealots were actually killing the fellow Jewish leaders, and that they would have held out much longer had there not been so much infighting amongst each other.
Yeah.
And there was 4 different groups within Jerusalem that were fighting each other, and then they were trying to keep the Romans at bay as well. And so there was actually like 2 layers. There was the city walls, and then there was the temple fortress itself. So when the Romans took the city, it took them a little bit longer to actually get into the temple as well.
Yeah.
But no, I think they took everything and they leveled everything. So what's really interesting is that we have believers in Jesus like living in Jerusalem at this time. And what we see in Matthew, I think it's 24, he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, basically when you see bad things happening on the horizon, get out of don't turn back for your cloak. Don't go down, like basically like head for the hills. And there was a group of Messianic Jews who went off into the mountains and heeded his advice and formed a Messianic community in the mountains. But I want to reiterate. Last week we talked about a little bit too. Is that when a Jew in the land of Judea accepted when a Jew accepted Yeshua as his Messiah in the first century in Judea, if you lived in Jerusalem, you still went to the temple. That was still the center of your faith. And we see Acts chapter 21, Paul goes to the temple to take what's called a Nazirite vow, which would involve like himself, like 3 to 5 animal offerings, which is really weird to think about. And then James says, take these 4 other men and pay for their expenses as well. Mm-hmm. So that would have been like 15 animals that he would have had to like offer in the temple at that time. And this was like 30 years after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And so in the Jerusalem Council, what's described in Acts chapter 15, they met in Jerusalem, and it says that James, this is historians say that James was in the temple every day praying on his knees, so much that his knees were like the knees of camels, because he was always on his knees in the temple praying. The temple was the center of their faith. It was the epicenter of everything for them, and everything revolved around the temple, even for believers in Yeshua. And it says in the book of Acts that even some of the Levites believed that he was Messiah, but they were still operating as Levites. Mm-hmm. So we have to remember that when we think first century Jewish believer, the temple was everything, and that was still the center of your faith. Nothing changed about that really. Up until its destruction, that was still where it all went down, basically. In Acts chapter 10, I won't get into it right now, but we have to remember that. So when the temple was destroyed, it's not only devastating for the Jewish people, but also the Messianic community, the sect that was known as the Way. So that was a very devastating thing. It happened on the 9th of Av. It's in Hebrew Tish B'Av, and there's a lot of crazy things that happened on the 9th of Av, spread out over a lot of hundreds of years. If you guys wanted to do some cool research, the 9th of Av is a really fascinating date, and to this day, observant Jews fast on the 9th of Av because of all the things that have happened on the 9th of Av. It's just a dark, dark day. Yeah.
Question: do you share these with us?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
'Cause I'm
if
like,
you want to.
I didn't bring a notebook.
Photographic memory.
Next time I'll
Yeah.
bring a notebook, but
That's another reason why I made these. Yeah, is
yeah,
because
if you could share it, because I'm like, there are so many things I want to write down, but I'm not
yeah.
able.
Well, last time
No,
I
totally.
didn't have a notebook either, and
Yeah.
I was like, there's so much, so
Right.
I know, I'm like
his tiny pieces
Right.
of paper.
cramming
Next
so
time
much
I'll
in.
bring a notebook. I think the thing I was gonna say before was just like I guess the way that the gospel has always been presented to me, it seems, and obviously anytime we're looking at a story from the outside the way that we do, like it's easy to go like, how could you not know that he was the Messiah? You
Yeah.
know, like it's so easy to like have that perspective, but imagining standing in a crowd of people and people are shouting to free one man and not the other, and I can imagine there had to be so much confusion in such a politically tumultuous time to like be standing there and having 2 men
Yeah.
who have the same name,
Yeah.
who are both like the faces of 2 completely different movements, and going, I have to pick a side here. And I wonder if when the temple was torn down, those people
Yeah.
are like, oh shit.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh crap! I just picked the wrong side.
What did we do?
Yeah. No, I'm sure they were regretting that decision.
I don't know. I just have never thought about it I've had little like tastes of thinking about it from that perspective,
Yeah.
but never so clearly as that.
And here's the
as
thing,
when
too,
you
is,
presented
like,
that information.
The Sanhedrin was comprised of either 70 or 71 elders. They say that, let's say there were 70, I forget if it was 70 or 71, I think it's 70. 65 of them were Sadducees, 5 were Pharisees. This was in the
Say
first
all
century.
of that again.
So the Sanhedrin, the council, the Jewish council that sentenced him to death basically and took him to Pilate, like they were like the ruling court basically of the Jewish people at that time. And they are a biblical thing, like in the book of Deuteronomy, you're supposed to appoint judges. It's a very biblical thing, but 65 of them were Sadducees, 5 were Pharisees. So the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection of the dead. They didn't believe in the prophets, that they were divinely inspired, that they were speaking the oracles of God. There's a lot of other really, really big differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead. They believed in angels. They believed in the prophets. And so when you have 5 and to 65, and here's this Messiah who says, tear down this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. They caught that reference. They knew that he was talking about the resurrection. When you have Paul standing before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 24, and he says, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead, he's talking to an overwhelming majority of Sadducees and a couple Pharisees. And so when Yeshua goes before the Sanhedrin, and he's talking all this language about angels and prophets and resurrecting and healing and everything else, and he's performing all these signs and miracles, it really freaked out the Sadducean. They were mostly priestly class, mostly priests, and they were very much in bed with the Romans because the Romans are the ones who appointed the high priests at that time. And so, naturally they were like, we got to get this guy out of here. He's going to disrupt our harmonious relationship between the Romans. And they lived a very luxurious lifestyle. The Sadducees believed that you live to the fullest extent, and there wasn't much of an afterlife. Actually, there was like you live for the here and now, and that's why we see Caiaphas lived in this. They actually unearthed his palace that he lived in. It was a very luxurious palace, and the Pharisees, however, believed the opposite. They were like, they actually believe that you should live very humbly, which we give them kind of a bad rap. But the Pharisees actually believe that you should not have a lot of physical possessions. And what's really fascinating is, so there's 5 Pharisees, 3 are named in the Gospels, and those would be, and of the 3, they're all either disciples of Yeshua, or they're sympathetic to the Yeshua movement. That's Gamliel in Acts chapter something. Gamliel is the one who says, be careful because you might find yourself fighting against God. And he's like, if this is of man, it will fizzle out, but be careful, you might find yourself fighting against God. So he's kind of like a little bit sympathetic. And then there's who's the other one? Nicodemus is the other one who probably sat on the Sanhedrin. He's a Pharisee who came to Jesus in John 3. And then Joseph of Arimathea was the one who went to Pilate to ask for Yeshua's body to bury it that night, because the Torah says that any man hanging on a tree overnight is a desecration of your land. And so he went and actually put him in his own family tomb, which is a big deal. So the Pharisees seemed to kind of like him a little bit. I don't know. I think because he's so different than the Sadducees, and they're like, Messiah is kind of like one of us, like he's kind of almost on our side. But there was some definitely words of rebuke for the Pharisees. But in Matthew 23, he says, when the Pharisees sit on the seat of Moses, do as they say, but not as they do. Mm-hmm. So he did kind of like give them a little bit of
Barabbas' name, how do we know his name was Yeshua? Like through the manuscript?
I want to say about half of the early manuscripts of Matthew have it as Jesus Bar Abba, or it'd be Yeshua Bar Abba. But I don't.
A little similar.
I
think I've heard of that before.
I don't quote me on the 50% of the manuscripts, but a lot of the manuscripts, to the point that historians unanimously agree that his name was Yeshua Bar Abba.
Okay.
Yeah, but they think that the copy has just left it out of respect.
I think I've heard of it before, but it's been a while.
You don't want to have the people who started copying manuscripts afterwards were probably like, well, we don't want them to have the same name. I mean, I understand their logic.
Right.
So
what an important piece to tell.
Right.
Like, I feel like I just feel like you gave me this chunk of understanding that I've never had before.
Well, I just recently learned it myself. But.
Well, I just think it's interesting that it's like, so when I pictured, feltboard style, when I picture that interaction, I'm always thinking it's the Romans or the Roman-controlled Jewish people like on the stage, and then you have like the Sanhedrin and they're working the crowd trying to get Barabbas dismissed and Yeshua, to the cross. But it seems like from that it's more logical that the Sanhedrin are all on the stage and they're all trying to get Barabbas dismissed and Jesus to the cross. But thinking about making America great again. I'm seriously thinking like, if Barabbas is a thug or a bad guy in the eyes of the crowd, and Jesus just came and healed people and gave them free food, and you know, even at that level, not like the what else did he do, but just you know, he had big crowds and he would feed thousands at a time, and he would, you know, do really cool miraculous stuff. But that thing of like the Sanhedrin being like, look, this is our guy. He's gonna help make Israel great again. You know, like, come on, let's get it together. And thinking about that kind of like backwards way of being like, he was in jail, and we were okay with him being in jail because we want to keep things okay with the Romans. But now that we've got a chance to get him out, you know, like wink, wink. You know, nod, nod. Let's get this guy out so he can make Israel great again.
Well, I think Yeshua had a pretty good chance of being recognized as the Messiah until, and I think even up until the Garden of Gethsemane, where you see, is it Peter who chops off the ear, and it's like, I think even Peter misunderstood his mission and his purpose. I think he thought that night it was like he's like building up. It's like it's on. We're gonna strap on swords. We're gonna chop people's ears off, and it was like, and I think he was caught off guard by the fact that no, I'm here to climb upon a cross and to bear the curses that you guys should be bearing. And for them, that probably threw a lot of people off, and they were like, no, like, I mean, they've been living under Roman occupation for 100 years now at this point, almost 100 years, and they're probably ready for it to be over. And they hear stories about the Maccabees. You know, the Maccabees were like these folk heroes. It'd be like hearing stories about like George Washington and, you know, like these great like American forefathers who like were super, and it invokes these like patriotic feelings. And suddenly, if like America were occupied by this, you know, like communist force or whatever like that, and we would like start sharing these stories. Remember when George Washington crossed the Hudson River? You know, remember we can do this. And so like that's how it was with the Maccabees. Is like, remember when Judah Maccabee, he like slayed those Seleucid Greeks, and then, you know, and their stories are just, it's crazy, like heroic stories the Maccabees performed. And they were probably thinking that happened just like 100 years prior, 150 years prior. And they were probably thinking about like, we can do this again. Like we can throw the Romans off. We can throw the Seleucid Greeks off and rededicate the temple. We can do this. So that fervor was there, but it just wasn't time. So yeah, the 9th of Av happened.
I just think it's funny that he cut the ear off. I don't know why I didn't think of that before, because it's such a weird thing, but I just imagine Jesus being like, not just on the, again, not on the deeper level, the heart level, but just on the surface level, like, you know, you can't kill someone that effectively by cutting off your ear. Like, you're not that good with a sword. Maybe you should consider a different career path here.
Like a fisherman with a sword.
Because I imagine he wasn't like, oh, I really want to cut off his ear. I imagine he was like, let me take a swipe at him. And he was like, oh, crap. And yeah, I mean, I just, you know, think of those things because, you know, Feldborg, you're like, oh, here's the nice kind of like,
he definitely
cut off the ear and
out.
healed it, and we always go straight for the heart, which is good ultimately, but there's also that practical aspect of like, you guys are not that qualified. You know, like,
should not have quit your day jobs.
Protecting Jesus.
Right.
Was there a prophecy about the ear?
Not that I know of. There may be. That'd be interesting if there was.
But can you imagine, like, I wonder if Jesus was just like, come on. You know what I mean? Like kind of rolling his eyes and like, now I have to fix this thing. You know what I mean?
Jeff Foxworthy.
Restore hearing or something, maybe?
It'd be cool if someone wrote a novel from that guy's point of view, the one that had the ear put on.
I feel
It'd be really interesting.
I think there's a book, possibly a movie, no, not a movie, but I've heard
Really?
a book from.
That's the
From that perspective.
with the menorah?
Yeah, this is the altar in the temple. This is the altar. So like they basically like that was the last stronghold, was like the altar, and the Romans came in, and this is them actually like, you know, kind of fighting amongst themselves, but the Romans also killing them off. But the altar, I mean, that was like everyone, they fought to the last man standing, unless you were taken captive and you became a slave. So
March to Rome.
That's a very
Yep.
real.
It's pretty horrific.
and they took it all. So this is a destruction of Jerusalem, artist depiction of it. But you did not pick a fight with the Romans in think you were going to win. That was a
Now
bad
take
call.
on the Empire.
This is the Arch of Titus. This is in Italy, in Rome, and this was erected by one of Titus's family members in tribute to all his victories. And then inside the Arch of Titus is this right here. This is Roman soldiers carrying off all the instruments that were in the temple, and so like that would have been the menorah that they rededicated. I don't know if that was the menorah, but
Did the Temple Institute restore some of these, or did they?
yeah, they've got a new menorah. They've got all the instruments, really. So that's them carrying all those things, all those.
Looks like I'm sorry to think off track. It looks like a camera or
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
yeah.
that does look
Spaceship
like a
thing.
camera. That does look like
So that was one of his great victories, and then this is him, the triumph of Titus, and you see the menorah in the background. So ultimate desecration of the menorah, that it'd be sitting in this pagan palace of this pagan emperor who was,
Yeah.
living a disgusting lifestyle. But
They're wearing something on their head. Trees.
I don't know.
Something.
what? The wreath on that guy?
Yeah.
Oh, it's a wreath.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are pictures you got online.
Yeah. So that happened. The leveling of Jerusalem and basically the decimation of Jerusalem was like an atom bomb went off. But that was the spiritual center of the Yeshua movement at that time. And for that to be leveled was huge. I mean, you could not be a Jew and live in Jerusalem at that time because you just couldn't exist. So the Yeshua movement, which was predominantly Jewish-led, was now decapitated and suddenly predominantly composed of non-Jews who had only recently came to faith in Messiah, the God of Israel. So now the majority of the believing, I hate to use the word Christian because it was kind of not around by this time, but like the majority of like the members of the sect known as the Way, or whatever you want, the Yeshua movement, were probably in Rome and Antioch. And that was the largest population of believers of Yeshua at that time. And so Jerusalem was their center. So when Jerusalem was leveled, it decapitated that head, and suddenly all the elders that was the Jerusalem council, the leaders of the early movement, they were gone. They were either killed or just scattered or taken prisoner. So in geology, there's this term geomagnetic reversal, where the poles actually swap and north becomes south and south. And it was almost like that. Like it was that huge of a transition. Gentile converts to the Messianic faith were seeking spiritual guidance in the same synagogues that may not be welcoming to them. So it'd be like basically if 1,000 of us, I said this the other night, like if 1,000 of us like were Gentile converts to the faith in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, like we become believers in the God of Israel, and we want to worship the God of Israel. Suddenly, if 1,000 of us went to the local synagogue on Lake Hollingsworth, which maybe like on a good night, maybe has, I don't even know. I don't want to speculate, but not that many people. And if 1,000, it'd probably be that ratio too. Is like we just converge on the synagogue, and we're like, teach me about the God of Israel. Teach me about the temple. Teach me about the Torah. And that's we're told in the prophets that I think it's Zechariah says that in those days 10 men will take hold of the cloak of one Jew and say, teach me your ways, because surely God is with you. And so suddenly all these Gentiles are flooding into this faith that was already there, but then all these Jews who maybe are like not okay with the whole concept of Yeshua being Messiah are like, whoa, slow down. We don't really know what to do with you at this point. We love that you love our God, but you got to slow down. And we see that with Acts 15. All these Jews are coming in, or all these Gentiles are coming into the synagogues, and suddenly there's this party of the circumcision that comes in. And the party of the circumcision they say you have to be circumcised and you have to keep the Torah to be saved. And then Paul gets wind of it, and he's like, no, that's not the case. And he goes back to the Jerusalem council, and the Jerusalem council says, no, have the Gentiles do these 4 things immediately. Okay? And so there was this problem there. There was like, you had Gentiles who were going to temple prostitutes, that night or the night before. They were coming into the synagogue, or they were eating like food that was sacrificed to idols. All kinds of sexual immorality going on. And so the 4 things that they say is like, don't eat food that's been sacrificed to idols. Don't eat blood. Abstain from sexual immorality, and don't eat something that's been suffocated to death, which were four very predominant, or very dominant things going on in Roman culture at that time, I guess. So the problem very much was like, what do we do with the Gentiles? How do we teach the Gentiles? But then in Acts 15 it says, let them go do those four things immediately. That will allow them to sit down at the table with a Jew, basically, and not discuss the Jew who's already been living a very pure life. And it says in Moses, that's kind of like an idiomatic term for the Torah. So it says the Torah has been taught in every synagogue since ancient times, on every Sabbath since ancient times. It's verse 21 of Acts 15. It says, so basically they do those four things. They get in the synagogue. They're able to sit down at the table and eat with a Jew because they abstain those four things. And then they'll slowly start to learn the ways of the God of Israel and slowly kind of like remove other nasty things about their life and still kind of like sanctify themselves through that process. Mm-hmm. That would be like a lifelong process. But
So it's really interesting to think about that process, because I think about like without any other reference point, like it's so obvious, like temple prostitute, you're like, it's so obvious how messed up that is.
yeah,
But if you grew up with that, like if you know that your dad, like if your dad did that, his dad did that, you're kind of like, you know, there's no frame. Maybe somewhere inside you, the spark of Yahweh is saying like, this is not okay. Like somewhere deep inside.
yeah,
But you know, with all the other layers of multi-generational things,
Yeah.
you're just like, this is so normal. But I thought about my friend who posted something on Facebook the other day about marriage, and he's a single dad. And he just posted something about like, someone told me this new definition of love, where it's like when you love someone and you unite with them forever, you become this kind of one unit thing, and you're just, you know, you're still your own person, but you're completely united with this person on every level. Something like that. I was like, yeah, that's marriage. I mean, that's what marriage is. And to him, it was like
it's revelation.
this revelation in a cloud.
Today, talk about how when two people are in love, they're basically committing not just to love one another, but that as a result of that love, they're becoming one unit, that they're becoming something brand new, almost like a whole new person. They're not just who they were when they were single anymore, they're this new thing together. And I just really love that idea of love, that's all. And I'm like, well, what else would it
So
be?
here's someone who doesn't have a biblical frame reference of what love is. But yeah, I would say that's probably rare.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, you have someone who all of their life and all their parents' lives and all their grandparents' lives, they would go and see, you know, temple prostitutes. It was like their civic duty to like go and worship these pantheon of gods and offer sacrifices to them or whatever. And it's like, you know, you go to work the next day, hey, I didn't see you at the Temple of Jupiter. You know, where were you the other day? So like for that guy to walk into a synagogue where purity is a big deal, like you wouldn't even think about those things, let alone go and do those things, and you wouldn't associate with those people. So here you're like crossing town to go into like this Jewish section. In Rome, there was actually a Jewish quarter in Rome. It was across the river, but it was a Jewish quarter, and they had synagogues, and they had a very vibrant Jewish community in Rome. So you actually would have to and to be seen with the Jews was almost like a negative thing, because you were leaving. It was your duty, and as a Roman, to worship the gods. And if you were monotheism was actually illegal in Rome, and that's where the term atheism comes from. It is actually a Greek word, which means that you can believe in one God and be an atheist. It's because you aren't a polytheist. Like, it was illegal to not be a polytheist in Rome, and they actually taught that if you didn't worship the gods, you brought bad luck to Rome. And so when we see these Roman Gentiles coming to the faith of the one true God because of the message of the gospel, they are really putting themselves out there, politically, socially, like probably losing a lot of friends, associating with these like Jewish people who do weird things. But the Jews had protection under Roman law. They were one faith that had protection under Roman law. It was legal to be a Jew. That was it. So the Gentile converts of the Messianic faith are seeking the spiritual guidance in the same synagogues that may not be welcoming to them. And you got to remember that no copies of the New Testament existed at this time. It wasn't until the third, 4th century Council of Laodicea that they actually got together and they go like, okay, we have all these letters, all these epistles, we're going to call this the New Testament. And it wasn't until the 300s that they had what was called the New Testament. Before that, their scriptures were the Torah and the prophets and the writings like the Psalms and everything. That was the scripture. And so when they would go to the synagogues and learn the scripture, they didn't have a copy of the New Testament. It's really fascinating to think about until the 3rd or 4th century. They probably had like random copies of Paul's letters floating around, Peter's letters or the Gospels floating around. So they probably heard things and read things.
Problem? Do you think there was like a translation barrier, maybe?
I don't know. I think mostly Paul wrote in Greek
Okay.
because he was probably writing to a Greek audience, Greek-speaking audience in a Hellenized world. So a lot of his stuff was probably in Greek. In these outlying Jewish communities, they all probably used the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so they're probably very, very immersed in Greek culture. It'd probably be rare to, like here in Lakeland, Florida, you go to the synagogue and you talk to the average attendee of the synagogue and they probably don't speak or read Hebrew. It's the rabbi who speaks or read Hebrew.
Yeah.
And they speak English. Same thing in the Hellenized Roman world. You go to a synagogue and everyone's going to speak Greek and the rabbi might speak Hebrew. Or he might be just enough that he can lead a service in Hebrew or something.
Okay.
Same thing there. So Paul was writing his letters in Greek. Paul was very fluent in Hebrew. He had to be a student of Gamaliel. They say to be a student of Gamaliel, you had to have the entire Torah memorized. Just where you just ream it off. Gamaliel was a big deal, and Paul was a student of him. So for Paul to flip over to the side of Yeshua to be a Messianic Jew was kind of a big deal. It posed a lot of problems for him. He's probably next in line to be like one of the great rabbis of Judaism. He is sort of, in my book, a great rabbi of Judaism. But here's a fun trivia question for you. In what verse of the Bible did Paul change his name from Saul to Paul?
No idea.
Something we always taught in Sunday school, right? Is that at his conversion, the road to Damascus, Paul changed his name, or Jesus changed his name from Saul to Paul. And there's actually nowhere in the Bible that he changed his name. He never changed his name. And Roman culture, Jewish culture at least, you had a Hebrew name and you had an English name, or a Roman name. And just like here, you have, you go up to a Jew today and you say, hey, what's your Hebrew name? They would be able to tell you their Hebrew name. They probably learned it at their bar mitzvah or at their birth. They were given a Hebrew name. Paul always had a Hebrew name, and that was Shaul, which is translated into Saul. So he was named Shaul, which means the inquirer, to ask questions, basically. Paul is from Paulos, which means little one or like humble one. So he kind of like picked that name probably because it captured the essence of like the inquirer, the asker of questions. So yeah, he always had two names, but he wrote to his Roman audience with the name Paulos, because in the Greek world, if your name didn't end with an OS or US, then it wasn't like a true male Greek name. That's why he chose Paulos instead of like just Paul or whatever. And that's why Jesus' name became Jesus, because US denotes that it's a male Greek name. Yeah, Yeshua.
No, go ahead.
Oh.
Just finish that thought.
Yeah, Yeshua would not have jived with a Greek audience because they would see that name and not think a male name. They would think something other than male. But it went from Yeshua to Ixus, with US, the OUS at the end, denoting it's a male name, and then Ixus to Jesus, to Jesus. And so that's kind of how that happened. So what were you going to say?
No, just the revisionist theology, because I've heard whole lesson plans about the Saul to Paul and why it's significant.
Oh, yeah.
And just
Well,
like, no.
Yeah, well, we want Paul to be a Christian. I mean, Paul was a Pharisee.
It's not a thing.
Yeah,
I mean,
no.
if it's a thing, sure, this is a great way to think
And
about it.
that's
but
kind of
not
like
a thing.
that's kind of the essence of why I wanted to start this
Right.
Bible studies, because we think that Jesus came and started a new religion.
Right.
We think that Paul helped him start this new religion, when in fact Paul died a Pharisee. And he says in Acts chapter 24, I am a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. He is using present tense. He's a Pharisee.
Right.
There was some things, he differed a lot on his theology from some other sects of Judaism at that time, but Jesus did not come to start a faith known as Christianity. He came to save the world, first of all, but also bring about the restoration of the nation of Israel. and reconcile humanity back to the Creator. But the whole new religion thing is something we want. Oh, I have it right there. Look at
Oh, the
that. Yeah, we want Paul to become a Christian because it fits into our theological box that we put him in. But he never did change his name. He remained a Jew to the day that he died. And in fact, he maybe even died with long hair, because if you look at Acts chapter 21, he goes to take a Nazirite vow, and one of the parts of taking a Nazirite vow is that you don't cut your hair until the end of the vow. Well, he goes to the temple to say, I'm taking a vow, but then they see him in the temple they think he's with a Gentile in the temple, but he's not. And so they think that he tried to desecrate the temple, and then he's arrested. So he tells them, okay, I'm initiating my vow, and then that would tell, okay, you can't get a haircut now. And this is all in Numbers chapter 6, by the way. But so then he's arrested and tried, and then he pleads his case to Rome. And then he's taken to Rome, and he's in Rome for like a couple of years. So he never had a chance. If he stuck to the terms of the vow and he never cut his hair, he would have had very long hair, and he died.
Paul is Paul.
Yeah, I mean, he was intense. He was a Torah Jedi for sure. He was a Jewish Jedi.
Must have been long hair.
Yeah. But it's something I just never saw in the book of Acts when he says, I am a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee. He was appealing to the 5 Pharisees that sat on the Sanhedrin at that time and saying, hey guys, I'm one of you. And that's why he split the Sanhedrin. That's why they couldn't make a decision, and they had to go to Rome go to the Romans. As Christianity grew and evolved, Jewish Christians became only one strand of the early Christian community, characterized by combining the confession of Jesus as Christ and continued adherence to Jewish traditions, such as the Sabbath observance of the Jewish calendar, observance of Jewish laws and customs, circumcision, synagogue attendance, and by a direct genetic relationship to the earliest Jewish Christians. So the early Yeshua movement maintained its Jewish identity for a few hundred years at least. It hit some snags. Mainly, first big snag was 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. That was a decapitation of the leadership. But it also, Emperor Vespasian came to power. He was the third guy, if you remember, of the Flavs, the Flavian dynasty. He was the third and the last of the Flavian dynasty. He instituted what's called the Fiscus Judaicus. So until this point, all the Jews in Rome were just kind of left alone, live and let live kind of thing. But then after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, they were like, all right, since you want to be bad boys and like revolt over and over and cause us all this problem and cost Roman lives through this siege and all this war that you've caused, we're going to start taxing you the equal amount of the temple tax. So every Jew had to pay a half shekel per head, basically, to help build the temple of the God of Israel. And so what they did is they said, well, we're going to take that same amount, but we're going to take it and we're going to use it to build and refurbish the temple to Jupiter. And so it was a really like a big slap in the face to Jews who were living in these because they weren't the ones that fought. They weren't the ones that started the revolt. They were out in the outlying Roman districts, and suddenly they're paying, it's 2 drachmas per person, per head, per year, I think it is, which is a pretty large amount of money for your average Roman Jew. And so the Fiscus Judaicus was like a big hit to the Messianic community because you had a lot of Gentiles who were going to the synagogue and doing a lot of Jewish things, and a lot of Roman Gentiles, and they were going and associating with Jews. They were worshiping with Jews. They were reading Jewish liturgy. They were learning Hebrew. They, maybe were keeping some form of the Sabbath or something. And then suddenly the emperor comes down and says, you need to pay a tax of this amount if you are a Jew. And so these Roman taxing authorities, they would look at you in the synagogue and say, you're a Jew. No, I'm not a Jew. I'm just here. I'm a Gentile. I'm a God-fearing Gentile. Remember we talked about those different categories of people. I never went through legal conversion. They were like, no, it doesn't count. You're going to pay the tax if you're a Jew, if you're worshiping like a Jew. If it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. And so what it did is it created a first like schism in the relationship between Jew, like even Messianic Jew, and God-fearing Gentile. At that time, it was like, well, we can't associate with them because if we do, we have to pay the Fiscus Judaicus, and that's a huge hit. And so it also was this inverse thing where the Jews were saying, well, they're here in our synagogues every Sabbath, learning our Torah and reading our liturgy and learning about our God. They have to pay the tax as well. You know, they were basically accusing them and ratting them out. Which this is about the same time that John writes his Revelation down, which is Yeshua speaking through John, and he's saying, talking to the I believe it's the congregation of Smyrna, and I forget the second one, but he calls them the synagogue of Satan, and he's like, you are Jew, you say you are Jews but are not. You are the synagogue of Satan, and a lot of people through past 2,000 years have taken that verse, Revelation 3:9, and just used it to like persecute Jews. But you know, like synagogue of Satan, it's just, you can take that and manipulate it so many different ways. But really, what he was saying, if you look at the Hebrew, and what's cool about this is Revelation was given in the Hebrew tongue. It says at the beginning of the book of Revelation that he spoke to him in the Hebrew tongue. So if you look at what Satan means in Hebrew, Satan means in Hebrew, it literally means someone who's accusing someone of something. Someone who's narking or saying, hey, they're doing this. And so like when he's saying you're the synagogue of Satan, maybe he's alluding to the fact that like the Jews there are ratting out the Gentiles who are worshiping with them and therefore having like tagging this tax onto them. I don't know. But part speculation. But then we read the book of Hebrews, it says, but recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with suffering, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, sometimes being partners with those so treated. So like God-fearing Gentiles going in the synagogues and being partners with those who are being afflicted, for you had compassion on those in prison and joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore do not throw away your confidence, which is a great reward. That's Hebrews 10:32. So because of the Fiscus Judaicus, it was very costly and illegal, actually, because you had to actually undergo a legal conversion to be a Jew. So if you were practicing belief in monotheism, you were breaking the Roman law. And if you were a politician or if you were someone who was a government official, like Cornelius, if you think of it, Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 was kind of breaking the law. I mean, by being a monotheist, by being a God-fearing Gentile, he was not doing a good Roman deed. So to be associated with the Jews or resemble anything Jewish was illegal and very taboo for any Roman Gentile. So the Roman taxing authorities did not care if you were not a convert. But if it looks like a duck, it quacks like one. But the Yeshua movement preserved still its Jewish DNA up until the 300s, probably. Despite all of that, there was a growing severing between the two groups. But up until the 300s, came some. I'll go through this real quick. I'm running out of time here, but the day after 9/11, so I have 7th graders last Monday, and I was asking them, like, what year were you guys born? And all of them were like 2003, 2004, or whatever. And I was like, wow, so you guys weren't alive like when 9/11 happened? They're like, no. And I was like, it's so weird to me that I guess this is the first year where 9/11 is in the history books. And I was just like, I cannot describe to you guys what the country was like the day after 9/11. Like, I can talk to you all day long, but the feelings, like people flooding churches and helping neighbors and, American flags everywhere. It was like, there was like this, just inswelling of like patriotism, of neighborly love, just all these great things that happened because of this great tragedy. And it's like, I remember waking up on 9/12 to a completely different country. It was like, do you guys experience that as well? Is it just me or?
I was really young, people were definitely, there was a lot of,
there's something different in the air.
Families were tighter, mothers are hugging their children.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've ever reflected on it that way,
Yeah.
but I was in
Glenn
9th
was
grade.
actually living with my mom
Wow, that's weird.
at that
You were
time.
in ninth
in
grade.
I was in 9th grade.
Miami.
And I was in college. That's weird.
Didn't go to school on 9/11.
Yeah, I didn't go to school.
Yeah, I was in class.
I was in class and they
In college, yeah.
I was in science class and they stopped our science class and everybody was called into the chapel area because I went to a Christian school and they pulled out this little old rickety TV on a cart.
Yeah. Turn the
like,
news on and stuff.
Turned on the news and like.
It was on every station.
Yeah.
What's weird
Yeah.
is that I
Like I remember them flipping over the channels. Like
No, not
Okay.
necessary. Right, like it was just everywhere, and they kept showing
Yeah.
that same clip over and over and over again.
Yeah.
we went to Rosen Spanish class, and the whole class went on a field trip to the theater. And since there were no, like, I had an old Nokia phone.
Yeah.
No, obviously no Facebook.
Yeah.
And so when it all was happening in the rest of the school, I mean, it was Valencia over in Orlando, so the campus is pretty spread out. But they have TVs throughout the campus. But we were the only place on campus in the theater that didn't have a TV, where no other classes or passerbys would go because it was a dedicated space and we were doing something, watching like some practice. So the people that were on the stage practicing in the Spanish class
Yeah.
that was huddled in these like 3 rows had no idea what was going on the whole time.
Yeah.
And no cell phones or any other form of communication. So for probably like an hour and a half or 2 hours, the rest of school is shut down
Yeah.
and we're in the theater.
Yeah.
And then when we walk out, it's just like lots of people
yeah.
around every
Yeah.
TV on
It's just
campus.
different. Yeah, everything's different. And I was trying to like explain that to my students. Like, you guys will never know the difference at 9/12 what it was when I woke up that morning. How different our nation was. It was like a completely different country. And but I kind of liken that to when the early believers try to convey to their own children or younger people, the generation behind them, what it was like when they had the temple, what it was like when they had Jerusalem, the holiest city, what it was like when they had Yeshua. You know, it's like, how do you convey all of those emotions packaged in, like, and it's like, in a couple of generations, all those things are just completely lost.
Yeah.
And it's like all those like amazing, wonderful things are just kind of washed out a little bit. But yeah, I just want to, we're jumping ahead here to like, so we had the Fiscus Judaicus in the 70, and so all the tribute, all the taxation was going to rebuild and refurbish the temple to Jupiter, which would have been a big smack in the face to every observant Jew. But then in the 300s, the Yeshua movement is still doing a lot of Jewish things, even though it might be alienated from the Jewish communities where it is to a certain extent. They're still doing very Jewish things. So when Rome becomes quote unquote Christianized in 312, you know, when Constantine sees this sign in the heavens, and he says, "By this sign you will conquer." Not a lot changes about Constantine's life. I mean, he's still he worshipped Mithra one day, and then the next day follows Jesus, which is fine, but he kind of conformed his following of Jesus into the Mithraic faith that he so dearly loved. So to have a Roman emperor convert to Christianity, convert to belief in Yeshua as Messiah, was pretty taboo. But here's some of the things that he said in 321. He says, "On the venerable day of the sun, which is Sunday, let the magistrates and the people residing in cities rest." Okay, so for Jews, you rested on the 7th day, Sabbath. That was when, you know, that was a very Jewish thing to do. It was like, that's what you did. But he was, like I said, he worshipped Mithra. That was the sun god, basically, the manifestation of the sun on Sunday. And so that was just kind of ingrained in him to do that. And Roman culture, all of Roman culture worshipped Mithra. It was one of the gods they worshipped. And so when he says, "Let all the people residing in cities rest, and let all the workshops be closed," in the countries, however, persons engaged in agriculture may freely and lawfully continue their pursuits, because it often happens that another day is not so suitable for grain sowing, for vine planting, lest by neglecting the proper moment for such operations, the bounty of heaven should be lost. So he's saying basically that's kind of where we see the beginnings of like shifting the Sabbath, the biblical Sabbath, from Saturday over to like the Sunday thing. And that's the first time we see like this noted effort to get people to start like actually like worshiping the God of Israel on a Sunday. The Council of Laodicea in 364 says, "Christians shall not Judaize, heaven forbid, and be idle on Saturday, but shall work on that day. But the Lord's day," which was, you know, this was 43 years after Constantine made this edict, "the Lord's day, which was Sunday, they shall especially honor, and as being Christians shall, if possible, do no work on that day. If, however, they are found Judaizing, hanging out with the Jews and doing Jewish things, they shall be shut out from Christ. So it's just interesting that in the 300s we see as the Romans start to really take hold of this concept of Jesus being Messiah and being Savior, they go from like very worldly pagan faiths and right into like Christianity, I guess, and bring with it some of the baggage that they had.
Well, it's interesting even to note, I mean, language, you and I were talking about, like, language is so fluid, but thinking about, like, Christians were only Christians because Gentiles were calling them Christians.
Yeah.
And then go back to where that was before.
Yeah.
And so it's like it's saying, I mean, you're talking about like the thing of Constantine going into, the God of the Hebrews, but I would say, I mean, Constantine, I think, went into the God of the Christians. But if the Christians were a people group that were initially defined by Gentiles, reinforced by Gentiles, and then eventually accepted by Gentiles,
It kind of almost became
it
its own
is.
entity.
I mean, it is its own entity.
Yeah.
It is. So Yeshua did not come to start a new religion, but a new religion was formed
Did
from
emerge.
day one.
Yeah.
Like from day one, Constantine didn't say, "Well, now I will submit myself to the God of the Hebrews." He said, "I will be
I'll add this.
Christian."
Basically, I'll add this God to my pantheon of gods.
And then
like-
even that, I mean, where it says, "shall work on that day," I mean, obviously the forciveness of that is pretty painfully apparent. But like the Lord's Day, I mean, when we talk about names, I call Leanne my wife, but that's not her name. That's a title, and I might refer to her that way within the context of being married to her. But to say the Lord's Day would just be like, if I am a peasant and you are a local authority, I might say, well, Lord Gabriel, because you are my Lord in that context. But the Lord of that day would have been the emperor. So on
it's
the
a very
emperor's
generic
day,
term. Yeah.
You shall honor this new
that's a good
religion,
point.
which is the emperor's religion.
I didn't see it that way.
But I just think about like Christmas and a lot of those things. It's like it's very logical that those things would fall in line because something new was created.
Yeah.
Well, and even now, like the times that which we kind of like let go of not celebrating those holidays because it was just too much and we weren't celebrating anything else, and then everything was kind of. It was just really hard for a season. But when I tried to have those conversations,
the vacuum is hard.
right? And when I tried to have conversations with people because people didn't understand why on earth we wouldn't celebrate Christmas, like how would we not celebrate Christmas? How would we not celebrate Halloween? Like all of these things.
It's very Christian.
Right. So I mean, but genuinely, like everyone.
skeletons for Jesus.
And so, but like starting to have those conversations, like even people who I felt like were people who spoke the language of like the same gospel that we understood, like talking about the same Jesus that we are, those people would be like, you have to be careful now, like you can't go down this whole Hebraic road too far, because like you really have to be careful of that stuff, And I just remember thinking to myself like, since when is it like blasphemous to like study what Jesus studied and like think about life the way that he would have lived it, and like how is that like
Be similar to him.
That sounds like that good.
what happened?
It's more live. Yeah, the last time I checked,
Justice is coming out looking very worried.
those are good points. And the last time I checked, the Gospels say that if you say he abides in you, then you should walk as he walked. And like, if you're not walking as he walked, then he doesn't abide in you. It's like that the two kind of go hand in hand. But that's a good point. So it's interesting.
Language is very telling.
Yep. It's just interesting. So like we go from this very Jewish faith, where it's centered on the temple, centered on a Jewish Messiah, to like the Council of Laodicea, Christians shall not Judaize. It's like, wait a second, I thought our Messiah was Jewish, and it's like this very weird like dichotomy that's created because of that.
It's such a
I
strong
was
separation.
confused when I took theology class at the seminary. They were going over this. I'm like, something's not right.
Yeah.
Will
Like,
was in seminary
I
to
started,
become a priest.
Catholic.
So
Yeah.
Or Catholic
Context.
priest.
Oh, what great context for all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
And now he's
Yeah.
Judaized.
Hanging out with
He's
the-
fully Judaized. Yeah.
No, I got my degree at Southeastern.
Oh, Southeastern?
It's a
Oh, okay.
school, or you know.
Yeah.
Oh,
I
for
got a
teaching
pastoral
some say.
ministry degree at Southeastern, so
Yeah.
Hmm.
I was Christianized there,
Yeah.
and I'm now
Well, that's and
figuring out life.
what I don't want you to hear is that
Yeah.
Christianity has it wrong. It's all by design. Just like that's why I kind of started off with Joseph, because
Yeah.
Joseph had to become a Gentile savior of the world. He had to change and conceal his identity to go into the Gentile world, to elevate it to the point when he reveals his true identity to humanity, will say, wow, the God of Israel. And that's why the prophets foretell, from one Sabbath to another, from one new moon to another, all flesh will come to worship me. That's talking about Jerusalem, a rebuilt Jerusalem, and the Christianity is by design. Nothing is outside the control of our Creator.
Right.
But when those scales start coming off our eyes, and we see the true identity of our Messiah as He's revealing Himself to His brethren, simultaneously, it's like to us, it's like whoa, we put our faith in Him as our Savior, which is great, but we didn't know this. We didn't know this aspect of Him per se, and what it entailed.
Right.
So,
You're saying last time, I think for the Mishnah,
Yeah.
Jesus will even be in the gates, the seats.
yeah, it's called the leper scholar, the leper Messiah.
The
Yeah,
leper
it's a
Messiah.
concept within Judaism that I think it's actually in the Zohar, if I'm not mistaken.
For the Zohar.
I
Yeah.
never read it.
Which is a mystic
really
text.
busy this week,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I still need to
Oh
do
yeah, I sent you that. They call him even normative Jews, non-believing Jews, call him They'll say that if Israel, the people of Israel, don't merit the king, that He'll send the leper Messiah, and he'll be sitting at the gates of Rome crying out for alms.
Oh.
And it's kind of a lot of code words for he's going to be someone who's stricken with the nastiest disease that is known to man at that time, and he'll be sitting at the gates of Rome, Rome being the source of all Catholicism, and crying out for alms, basically crying out pay attention to me, I'm your leper Messiah, I'm unclean, because so it's really a lot of code words there.
Right.
But I want to talk about John Chrysostom. I think this is one of the last things I want to touch on. 368. This guy was kind of the nail in the coffin.
Ooh.
We're talking about the split, okay?
Yeah.
The split of the Messianic Yeshua movement, the sect known as the Way, which was iconically Jewish in its appearance and practice, to all the way to Roman Catholicism, and how different it looked and how much it hated the things the Jews did. This guy wrote 8 homilies, and he was a great what do they call them? Rhetorical or
Orator?
orator. Thank you. Yeah, they called him the Golden Mouth. He was a great orator, but he was raised in a very pious Roman home, and they worshipped all the Roman gods. So he was raised by his mother in this home, and then he converts to what was then called the Christian faith at that point. And then what does he do? He writes these 8 homilies called Against the Jews. And in these 8 homilies, let me go to the note real quick. If I can get there, I wanted to read just snippets of these homilies. Like I said, this was the nail in the coffin between Jewish believers and Gentiles, God-fearing Gentiles. So he says, Chrysostom denounced Jews and Judaizing Christians in a series of 8 sermons delivered to Christians in the Church of Antioch, which is one of the biggest, largest populated Jesus followers, city of Jesus followers, who were taking part in Jewish festivals. So in 386, we had Christians, followers of Jesus, who were still doing, let me see, I'm going to see what time period, 386. Even almost 400 years after the ascension of Yeshua into heaven, he has this problem that he feels like he needs to address with 8 sermons, basically, that followers of Jesus were still participating in Jewish festivals. They were still participating in Jewish observances. It is disputed whether the main target were specifically Judaizers or Jews in general, but his homilies were expressed in the conventional manner, utilizing the uncompromising rhetorical form known as sogos. Is that how I would say that? He claimed that the Sabbath, I'm skipping down to the fourth paragraph, he claimed that the Sabbaths and the Jewish festivals and synagogues were full of Christians, especially women, who loved the solemnity of the Jewish liturgy, and they enjoyed listening to the shofar on New Year's, on Rosh Hashanah, and applauded famous preachers in accordance with the contemporary custom. A more recent apologetic theory is that he instead tried to persuade Jewish Christians who for centuries had kept connections with Jews and Judaism to choose between Christianity and Jewish. So basically he's like drawing a line in the sand. He described the synagogue as a place worse than a brothel and a drinking shop, and it was a den of scoundrels, a repair of wild beasts, a temple of demons, and the refuge of brigands and debauchers, and a cavern of devils, a criminal assembly of the assassins of Christ. So this guy is coming up and he's saying all these things about the Jewish faith and Jews in the synagogue, and so this guy was like the nail in the coffin for the severing of these two faiths, basically, that never should have been severed. So it's really, really sad to see John Chrysostom, and he's considered one of the great fathers of Christianity.
Oh, Apple. Sorry, I just realized you were on it.
Yeah.
Apple, 'cause it looks easier to navigate.
This is random on that side
It's okay.
thought, were you doing this in Google Docs?
Google Slides, yeah. Yep. So it's all in the cloud.
I just have never seen like a PowerPoint presentation done through
Yeah.
Google. I do all my other stuff in
That's all I do.
Google. I just have never done that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
that makes it easier for sharing too.
Yeah.
So why is all this important? Why does it matter? Obviously because we love our Savior. We love our Messiah.
Amen.
I remember when I was going to the Presbyterian church, I'd always say I just want to be like the Acts church. I just want to be like the first century church. They had it simple. They just did things simple. Book of Acts talks about they shared their possessions. They sold property to fill each other's needs. I just want to be like the Acts church, And I didn't really know what I was kind of getting myself into. The Acts church was iconically Jewish in practice and just flavor, just very Jewish kind of thing going on. So I want to get back to the Acts church. It's still my mantra. I want to get back to the Acts church, but I want to do it free of bias and free of prejudices against things that look Jewish or appear Jewish. That's going to make me kind of almost look Jewish sometimes, which is fine because I want to look like my Messiah. And if he was a Jew, then I'm going to do some iconically Jewish things. But that's not to attain salvation. It's to make me a better disciple of my rabbi, because salvation has already been bought at a price. It is to be to better understand who he was, what he taught, and I do those things because he says, "Go out and make disciples," and teaching them everything that I commanded. It's just a matter of it's a lifelong process of just trying to grow closer to your rabbi, basically. And that's what we're going to talk about next week, discipleship. And what that is from a Jewish perspective is a lot different than what it is from a Christian perspective, what it entails. I'll get into that, the history of the concept of disciple and teacher, or students and rabbis, is iconically Jewish concept. So to understand the teachings of Yeshua to the fullest extent, we must listen to the surrounding historical and social and religious context, and we must become his first century audience. So it's like we have to put ourselves back in the shoes or the sandals of a Galilean Jew and re-listen to the Sermon on the Mount, reread the Sermon on the Mount, listening the way they would have heard it. And the best way to do this is the best way to learn is to do. It's like kinesthetic learning. It's like doing something and applying the things. Someone can just talk all day long, but if you never do it, so the best way to love is to do. If you're married, obviously, you can say I love you all day long, but if you don't show it with your actions, it's completely different. And the best way to imitate is to do, and the best way to disciple is to do. So our calling is simple: to live like our Savior. And I'm reading all this because it's being recorded for people to listen to. Otherwise, I wouldn't. Figuring out how he lived and applying it is the tricky part, and requires a deep analysis of his history, his teachings, and removal of our own biases and pride. So I just wanted to reemphasize, it is a lifelong journey. There's no rush. this will be on the slides if you guys wanted to go back and read. This is where I got a lot of my research from. Just over the years, I've read a lot of books, but these are the ones that I can recommend to you that are from good authors. Restoration, the one in the middle there, was just amazing. Just absolutely changed my view on a lot of stuff. And Jesus Through Middle Eastern Eyes is really good. So I'll leave that in there, and when I share it, you guys can go back. But
Thank you very much.
yeah, what do you guys?
Yeah.
Any thoughts from y'all?
I think it's interesting the thing of why does it matter?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was brought up in a spiritual mutt as far as going to, we moved around a lot, and we went to a lot of different denominations, Catholic, all the mainline denominations, a lot of splinter denominations.
Yeah.
But my mom always had kind of a Hebraic bent all the time, like alongside that. And so it's weird stuff. Like, I've been to all denominations, and they all
Yeah.
are surprisingly similar for all the ways in which they would fight and say like, no, we're different from you. They're all very, very similar at their core, except for that Hebraic kind of thing that was always alongside that. And it's offensive. Like, I don't think there's anything, especially, and I'm seeing this more now that I ever have it, I don't think there's anything truly offensive about most Christian churches, especially because in a lot of Christian churches, not all, but in a lot of them, we're getting to the point where it's socially acceptable to be like, my faith is one of the many great faiths, and I just want to be on the journey with other people of faith who are going toward truth. And I'm like, okay, but you and I may define truth differently, and those differences aren't like Pepsi versus Coke. Those differences have substantial and weighty chasms that can't coexist. And the thing of like being in a context where you have this happening, like I'm talking about, where Constantine both drives but also comes into a new religion, which is called Christianity, which is coexisting with a sect of the long-standing faith of the Jews. He comes into that context, and it's like, oh, okay. I love this idea of a man called Jesus, and I love these myths around that man. I think he would make a great addition to what I've already got going on. And we find ourselves in an America that's very much that way. That coexist thing, the whole thing of like, as long as we're journeying toward faith together.
It's a very abstract, like airy thing.
Then
It's like, what does
it's a
that
good
entail?
thing.
It's very muddy.
The Christian, like nothing about the modern Christian church is offensive to other Christians or to our culture or both. Like, what's your main?
Right. Progressively, there is a sense of we all want to be going toward the same general thing. Like and there are some truthful things in, like, I read a lot of like Brian McLaren's work, a lot of Rob Bell's work. The main Christian authors and pastors, the ones that kind of speak for Christianity in America, are all starting to sound very similar in their acceptance of this idea that truth is greater than any one denomination that started there, and that it's any one religion. There is a truth that we should all seek for. And that's starting to sound like the thing of like, well, we have a bunch of gods. We've got Jupiter and Era, and I'm going to forget what they are, but like, we've got a bunch of different gods, and as long as you worship one of those gods within the context of knowing and accepting that the other gods are legitimate, like, you can kind of have your personal preference. To my understanding, in Rome or in Greece, you can have kind of like one focused god. As long as you accepted all the other gods as being gods, you could really feel like Jupiter. I'm all about Jupiter, but Zeus and whomever else, I'm going to mix cultures, but like all these other gods are still legitimate. I really love this one in particular, so I'm spending more time on that. It's kind of like, okay, truth is what's important. Faith is what's important. We just need to be people of faith.
We don't know what that. We don't
It
know the
doesn't
concrete
matter.
definition of what those things are.
Even like the people who do the subtle thing where it's like, well, Allah is just a title for God, so worship. Some people call God Allah, and some people call Allah God, and it's really just about having an intelligent creator or an intelligent center of the universe. But that thing of melding, and so you start being more of an extremist to say there's one way, and even the churches that amazingly enough preach like Christ is the only way from the pulpit, but then you start to look at how does that play out, and it's like, that doesn't quite match what you're saying. Progressively more and more, even in the way of like it used to be, the sanctity of marriage, and there's a lot of stuff about how the church has fallen down about loving people and failed in a bunch of ways, but it's also like, in light of that failure, we haven't doubled down on loving people and upholding the law. We've just said, we messed up, you know what? This one's on us.
Yeah.
Just come on in and you're totally fine, because we did a poor job of addressing that before. But abortion's the same way. Marriage and divorce is the same way. There's been waves of issues where we've we've done a poor job of addressing it on the onset.
Yeah.
But then we just kind of go like, okay, well, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
Or it's like there's forgiveness, but there's that little bit of a wink at the end of like, you got an abortion, there's forgiveness. Kind of the wink at the end is like, it's kind of okay.
Yeah, that's not the
It's kind of okay.
go on but stop your sinning kind of
Right.
like message. There's grace that's brought you reconciliation, but there needs to be subsequent repentance and walking in truth.
And you can't just keep on doing it again.
Yeah, if you think of it from the very start, so the serpent comes to Eve and he's like, did God really say? And those are the first words we ever see from this adversarial force we call Satan. Did God really say? And so when we hear preachers even today saying, or anyone, it could be me, I say it in my own life, did God really say? And those 3 words opened up this Pandora's box of sin and curse and death that we all are going to pay for and have paid for a lifetime until a new heavens and a new earth are established. But it's like that did God really say is so permeated our culture, and that is just the simple tactic that our enemy used from day one. And it's we didn't learn our lesson. And what's interesting about that is he used did God really say don't eat? And what do we see Daniel is used in this mighty instrumental way because because someone put a plate of food down in front of him and they said eat, and he's like, no, God said don't eat this kind of stuff. He's like, this is a sacrifice to idols, it's probably not kosher food, we're just going to eat vegetables. And then because he almost reversed Eve's decision to eat and Adam's decision to eat, God used him to become second in command in all of Babylon and to become this great ambassador for the God of Israel. Because of that, become an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar. Is it Nebuchadnezzar? Just because he said, no, I won't eat, it was this reversal of that. It's just something we just put in our mouths. When he could have just been okay, yeah, I'll eat. And he just would have assimilated right into Babylonian culture and just done his thing and been fine. And not been thrown into a lion's den and everything else. So
it's also just interesting that the thing of offensiveness, my mom really pushed for us to adopt, as many Jewish things as possible, but my dad wasn't having it. But I went to boarding school and I didn't eat pork, religiously didn't eat pork. And it is a weird thing because you could be any other reason to not eat pork, be I don't like it, I have a dietary restriction, any other reason, and people would just shrug and move on. But if you're no, I'm eating kosher, they'd be whoa,
Right.
whoa,
Calm
settle
down.
I think that was the thing that somebody responded to. I got so many different kinds of responses about not celebrating Christmas. But saying something about not eating pork well, why?
Right.
And like, if I don't like it is the answer, which is not true. Like, you know, but if I
People are
said,
like, whatever.
you know, from a biblical perspective,
Well, 'cause
from
it
scripture,
implies that
whatever,
they-
that was when somebody responded and was like, you have to really be careful with that, you know. And
Yeah.
like, this is like someone who has like seriously studied the scripture a lot and stop.
Because what they're hearing when you say that is that by eating something that the Bible tells us to abstain from, that they are, they're sinning, because you're getting serious in this avenue of your life, and they're not, and it's like almost like judgmental sounding.
Right.
And we hate someone telling us how to live our life here in America. We hate it when someone says you have to live by this standard. And so, but yeah, I mean, that was the very first. That's how sin entered the world, is through our mouths. If you think of it, it's like, it's just interesting that, I mean, you have thousands, if not millions, of pastors that will stand up on a pulpit tomorrow and afterwards go to eat a pulled pork sandwich, and it's like, like I'm not like, obviously, I was there at one point, and I don't think I don't know where I'm going, but anyways, I just want them to realize that sin entered the world through the temptation of our taste buds, and Daniel was elevated,
Eating in their bedrooms.
just like Joseph was elevated second command, because he abstained from the simple temptation of what his taste buds. I mean, that plate of food probably contained things he never saw in his entire life, and probably looked really good because he abstained from it. Just the simple test, the simple temptation was elevated to this great, powerful position. Joseph had to undergo the temptation of sexual desire through Potiphar's, right? Yeah. And because of that, got put in prison again. But it was like that simple test that he passed that elevated him. Yeshua was tempted with bread, and he said, "No, man doesn't live on bread alone." It's just like these simple little tests, and they just elevate us if we pass those tests to the greater. It's like if you're faithful in the small, He'll trust you with the big. And that's.
It's also so interesting to think about those situations, because had they done what was expected of them, I mean, like, Potiphar's wife fully expected Joseph to have a physical affair with her for some length of time, and I'm almost going, it probably wouldn't have even been a big deal.
Yeah,
Right.
kept
Like
it under wraps.
It just,
Yeah.
like,
He would've
I'm
just
sure that
kept
she had
on.
done that before with
Yeah.
the male servants or slaves
Sure.
at the house. Potiphar probably was even aware of it on some level, like, yeah, my wife is kind of promiscuous,
Yeah.
whatever, she's attractive, or I don't care, or whatever. He
Mhm.
probably also was doing his own stuff. And so it's almost like, okay, the worst that could have happened is it's no big deal. But going through that and specifically doing something that was very offensive and got him into trouble was what allowed him to rise above just that guy. Like, let's say he just gone through that, and he was like, when in Rome, he could, I mean, I believe, God is a sovereign God, and God is in control, and, I fully trust in that, but I also know that in some strange way, we are in the real context, like, we're not at his level, so Joseph just said, okay, no big deal. When in Rome, God finds another way to raise, and I mean, I'm saying that, I would say at this level, I know God is sovereign, but from my vantage point, I'm going, okay, we would have seen God's plan work out some other way through someone else, but Joseph probably would have just been, that guy, and he would have been one of the servants for a while, and maybe get sold to somebody else, or, and just, he would have just been just another Jew, making his way through life, as opposed to Joseph, foundational for, our whole faith and ultimately for our Messiah. So it's weird to think, like, those offensive things, so many of them, like Abraham leaving would have been offensive to his family, offensive to all of, when I said family, like his extended family, and, for them to give up being idol makers. All of those things started an offense. Jesus started an offense because he was born to a virgin, which would have offended all of their religious family.
We were talking about that last week.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like he like prepared us for that when he said, like, who are my brothers, who are my sisters, who's my mother, who's my father, like those who are doing the will of my Father. And it's like he's almost preparing his followers, saying, "Look, those people are going to turn their backs on you because you're offensive to them, basically." And like, but the people who are doing what we're doing are on board with this. They're gonna like replace those people in your life, basically. So just be prepared for that. But yeah, I appreciate you guys coming tonight. I want to talk about well, next week I was going to talk about discipleship. So if you guys want to research discipleship, you guys are welcome to come next week. But discipleship from a Jewish perspective. But I get this awkward feeling whenever I send out invites on Facebook, because I feel like when I invite people individually on an individual basis, I feel like I'm pressuring them, and I'm such like a non-pressuring person. Like I just don't ever want to feel like I'm pressuring anybody. So like what I was gonna do, I created a Facebook group, but it's called. Actually, I just pulled it up real fast.
You can definitely invite them.
Yeah.
Has a chill.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wanted to pattern what we do here, like in our home on Saturday nights, after the concept of like what's called a Beit Midrash, and it's a Jewish concept. It just means house of study, and it's not about me. It's not about like, it's all about our Messiah. It's all about Yeshua, and like,
Amen.
oh, if you don't see my Donald Trump fan page, come up here. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
Oh look,
looks like,
notification from William.
It looks like we will probably only be able to come like every other week according to our work schedules.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Right
And that's
now.
kind of what I want,
That's
is like,
sad.
I want it to be sort of like, I want it to be able to be sort of a revolving door of people. Like,
Yeah.
that's what I'm gonna touch on here in a second, but like, so I created this group on Facebook, and it's a closed group. So like, you can request to join, and then I have to approve you, because to be honest with you, like, I don't want just like anybody and everybody come to my house. Like, I want it to be sort of like an exclusive thing. Like, you guys are welcome to invite people if they're like solid people. Like, just let me know.
They aren't
Like,
gonna like be screaming.
yeah, like they're not
Right.
crazy people.
Like-
And I want people who are serious about the word, like
Yeah.
people who have
Yeah.
a genuine faith, like, and are really serious about their faith.
Right.
Oh yes, I got a friend request. It's a good day. It's a good night.
How is John? I'm on his phone.
Oh, nice. So I made this group right here, and I just called it Beit Midrash Yeshua, because it's like house of study of Yeshua, and I thought that was just really fitting, because that's what I want my house to be. Is like when it says like when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way and you lie down and when you wake up. Like, I would love for my house to be like a central location where we study Yeshua, and like that's so Beit Midrash Yeshua at Lakeland, and you're welcome to join that group. And then what I'll do, instead of sending everyone invites, is I'll just post on there, and then it's less weird and awkward to be like, hey, are you coming tonight? Like, so I'll post on there, and then I can post documents on here and events and everything else, audio recordings and stuff like that. And then what I want to get to do is so what Stacey and I are thinking is doing like 3 weeks on. So like this is our second week of 3, and then 1 week off.
Okay.
And so it gives us a chance to take a break and just go out of town for a weekend or something.
Yeah.
And then we'll do 3 weeks on, 3 weeks off, and just keep doing that and see how we like it.
Yeah.
But it'll allow me to create sort of like a schedule of topics.
Yeah.
If you guys have a topic you want to talk about and like research, and like we can talk about it, then we'll have sort of like the schedule pre-plotted out. And so people like who have a really busy schedule and they want to see like, okay, 2 months in advance, I really want to make it here, and I see that they're talking about a prayer from a Jewish perspective. I really want to make it to that. It's not for another 4 weeks, but I want to make it to that. That'll give them the opportunity to see kind of ahead of time what's going to happen. But yeah.
Jessica asked if we could do this earlier.
Yeah, what time?
She wants to do more.
Stacey was saying 5 too.
Or 5?
We do dinner with our kids at like 5, so
Okay.
So we can come at like
we come at like 4.
Yeah, and
But I mean, this
we
is
are
also
fine.
fine.
What I was envisioning too is like, talk about like the Acts church, like they would get together and they would break bread, and someone would sing a song, and someone would bring the teaching, and someone would bring prophecy, someone would bring prayer. Like that's kind of what I'm like. I'm not trying to start, like I want it to be like a revolving door of people, but I want it to be like when you come, if you haven't come in 6 weeks, you know the general flow of it, and like it's just like kind of just a welcoming. Hey, we haven't seen you in a while, but it's not like this. Where have you been? But I'm not trying to start a church.
Sway, obviously, I would love for it to be better.
Yeah. Because like, I want them to be like standalone topics where you can come and like hear like something that but So yeah, if we wanted to eat dinner here, like closer to 5 or something like that, and then we all just kind of contribute.
Yeah, and
Um,
definitely bring like a dish or something.
Yeah, that would work. It would kind of
Probably put
take
less
pressure off
cheese
Stacey.
on it, depending.
Look, you put all the cheese you want, because those enchiladas
Yeah.
are bomb.
Obviously,
John wants one in a
Yeah.
minute, we'll have to do one up, or two, or
Yeah.
five.
those look good.
I had 5 plates of what you made.
I
Five?
put,
Stacy made, yeah.
5?
Yeah.
Really? You're not exaggerating?
Literally.
I
Wow.
put 6
Yeah,
pounds
4
of
of my
cheese
own and I
on
ate
there.
all these
That's
plates.
intense.
He doesn't look like
I guess I
it,
can stop the
but
recording.
He eats more food than